Welcome to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mock. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience of the broad front that we need to win. This week on the show, I'm joined first by Nizhmy Zarenko, co-founder of Put People First Pennsylvania, whose organization has been fighting for Medicaid rights for over a decade, to talk about how rural and urban Pennsylvanians are fighting back against Trump's Medicaid cuts with the nonviolent Medicaid army. Then I'll talk to writer and organizer Asha Ransby-Sporn about building durable political power in the 5 years since the 2020 uprisings and what comes next. But first, these headlines. It is late June, so that means it's Supreme Court season. Yay. Unfortunately, SCOTUS was never going to save us, and over the past couple weeks, they have confirmed that analysis. There are a few big opinions that are still on the docket as we record on Friday afternoon, but this morning we got deluged with a bundle of them, like the one affirming South Carolina's right to effectively defund Planned Parenthood, or upholding Texas's right to require identity verification to view porn online, which, by the way, has very little to do with porn, but everything to do with de-anonymizing and surveilling all of our internet use all the time, which is cool. But we have to talk about this decision where the divided court basically washed their hands of oversight of executive orders. This was in response to the administration's request to narrow the scope of lower court injunctions against executive orders, limiting them to the states, groups, and individuals named in the suits, meaning that only the people and groups who have the time and resources to lawyer up will gain protection of the courts. Look, this is about the Trump administration's willful reinterpretation of birthright citizenship in this country, but it's also about ending the judicial branch's power as a check on the tantrums of an increasingly authoritarian executive branch. To be clear, Trump and Attorney General Pam Bondi did this victory lap press conference celebrating its decision as an end to those checks and balances you might have been taught about in middle school civics class, intended to prevent our government from becoming an authoritarian dictatorship. The so-called unitary executive theory Federalist Society goons are laughing all the way to the bank, aka they are really committing to an early days Nazi vibe now. On the night of June 21st, Donald Trump superseded congressional authority to declare war and ordered U.S. troops to carry out 3 massive airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites. This followed weeks of unprovoked missile strikes on the country by Israel, which terrorized its most populated city and capital of Tehran. A striking factor in these completely unnecessary attacks is the hack job from both the White House and the mainstream media to manufacture consent amongst Americans for war with Iran. They pulled out their dusty old playbook from 2003 to claim for just a few days that we are preventing a dangerous madman from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Stop me if you've heard this one before. These same mouthpieces are now clamoring to laud Trump's attacks as a groundbreaking success, which, according to many sources, including the military itself, haven't impacted anything of substance. The even bigger fail is that the general vibe amongst everyday Americans is that this foray in Iran is merely an extension of the ruling class's unbreakable commitment to spending our money to prop up the violent aggression of Benjamin Netanyahu's genocidal Zionist regime. Poll after poll shows that Americans are overwhelmingly no longer in support of our commitment to Israel's wars and genocide against their neighbors and occupied territories. In a shocking turn of events, no one's in the mood for more forever wars delivered by the president who promised no more forever wars. The administration's inability to maintain narrative control is yet another sign of weakness. In a regime that's dedicated to projecting strength and an opportunity to organize people who took Trump at his word when he said that he would keep us out of an imperialist entanglement away from MAGA. And as most of our listeners most likely know by now, Democratic Socialist Zoran Mamdani defeated disgraced former sex pest governor Andrew Cuomo in New York City's mayoral primary Tuesday night by a massive 7 points. Almost immediately, a coalition of some of the worst people you know began scrambling to figure out how to reverse the mandate of New York voters and sabotage Mamdani's general election campaign against equally disgraced and very unpopular incumbent mayor Eric Adams. And that includes many of Mamdani's fellow Democrats. Cuomo has batted around the idea of running as an independent, while some of the city's most obnoxious billionaires are publicly plotting an astroturfed write-in campaign. That is to say, there is still a long road ahead for Mamdani before he can secure victory and work to deliver on any of his campaign platform, and that path is going to be littered with endless road spikes of bad faith Islamophobic attacks fueled by billionaire money. There are also a couple of big shifts that Mamdani's decisive primary win may indicate, and we'll be talking more in depth about how this all happened on the show in a few weeks, but I wanted to mark a couple here. First, Mamdani's campaign was very clear about their message. The fact that they were able to sum up the entire platform with a single resonant word, affordability, was a massive narrative win and something which broke out beyond people who self-describe as the left. Second, this campaign was won on the doors. Mobilizing 50,000 volunteers is doing serious numbers, and the linkage of this narrative clarity with a motivated and engaged volunteer base cannot be understated. And third, it seems like Palestine is no longer the third rail that it once was. Not only was Mamdani very clear about his stance on Palestine, he and co-endorser Brad Lander went out of their way to demonstrate solidarity across Muslim and Jewish communities in New York City. It's almost like people who think that human rights are for people think that apply to all people. And don't think I forgot about you, Buffalo. Congrats to progressive Sean Ryan for shouldering out corporate shill Chris Scanlon in the Democratic primary for mayor there, too. So we've been talking on this show about the character of state-level fights to resist the Trump administration's draconian cuts to Medicaid and Medicare, and I'm pleased to share another dispatch in that series this week. Nijbi Durenko is the co-founder of and an organizer with Put People First Pennsylvania, an organization working to bridge the urban-rural divide in Pennsylvania to fight Medicaid cuts. Nijbi, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Caden. It's good to be here.
Awesome. Well, could you tell me a little bit about your campaign? Who's part of your coalition, and what is the kind of terrain that you are navigating in Pennsylvania?
Of course. Yeah, so your listeners may not be familiar with Put People First PA yet, so let me give you a little thumbnail sketch. We're 13 years old this year. We were founded in 2012. I'm a co-founder. We are a completely member-led, staff-free organization, which is an interesting thing about us. And we fight for healthcare as a human right, which has really helped us organize across the state of Pennsylvania. Some things about Pennsylvania for folks who may not know, our tagline is the Keystone State. And Keystone in the architecture, right, is the stone that kind of holds the foundation together, holds the structure together. And when you think about Pennsylvania, it's a pretty big state, 13 million people. It is part of the Northeast Corridor. It's part of, sometimes it's considered part of the.
Looks like I lost Nishmi, which is too bad. Quickly, while we wait to see if she returns, I am going to enter a little bit of plug for our 2025 Summer Fund Drive. Every summer, we make a focused effort to raise money to sustain our publishing, and this year we've set an ambitious goal of $100,000 for Movement Media. Anyone who starts an annual or monthly subscription or gives $25 or more, or if you're a current subscriber, upgrades their subscription, will receive a special thank you gift. I want to invite you to head over to bit.ly/summerfunddrive, all one word, to make your contribution today. And of course, there will be a link to that in the show notes. It looks like we've got Nijbi back.
Yes.
Hey, welcome back. No worries.
Thanks.
You were just talking about
yes,
the way that Pennsylvania is both the Northeast Corridor and kind of the Midwest.
Right. Well, it's actually on the Mason-Dixon line, right? It's part of the Rust Belt. And so we are sort of a cornerstone, I think, for the country. And we have all those elements, and we certainly are part of Appalachia too. Mm-hmm. And so I think that makes us a really important site for the kind of organized.
No. It's so rough when guests have connectivity problems. Let's see. Like, I did my Fund Drive CTA. Let's give her another moment and we might move along. Yeah, why don't we cut to a quick break and regroup? All right, this is the fun of doing it live. Hopefully third time's the charm.
I genuinely don't know what's going on. I'm on a hotspot, so we'll try that. Okay, Pennsylvania is the Keystone State. We're in the middle of all of these different dynamics, and we've got.
I think let's call it and cut to Asha. We'll try and record something with Nijmi at some point in the future. Great. My next guest is Asha Ransby-Sporn, who's a Chicago-based organizer and writer who's also a co-founder of Black Youth Project 100. I'm only going to gloss the long list of organizing and struggle that she's been a part of for the past decade plus, from ballot initiatives for affordable housing, progressive taxation, and non-police mental health programs, to divestment from private prisons and helping elect Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago, in 2023. Alongside all of this work is Asha's poignant writing, recently publishing in These Times on the work of contesting for power in Chicago since Johnson's win, and for Hammer and Hope on the need for Black left leadership in a moment of strident backlash against the gains of the last 5 years. We'll publish links to those pieces in the show notes. Asha, welcome to Block and Build. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Kaden.
It's good to catch up. I feel like I haven't seen you in a million years. So.
I know.
I know that you've written a lot about the lessons of Black Lives Matter, and obviously June of this year in particular feels like timely, and it makes sense that a lot of folks are taking stock of the George Floyd uprisings 5 years on. One thing that's been giving me a little hope in this time is how willing so many folks have been in this moment to reflect on what happened and what we've learned. And that's the kind of thing that's going to let us really iterate on our strategies in real time a lot faster. And this is a big question. So, and I think it's in part because there's a lot of answers, but I'm curious if we could start with what some of you see as some of those lessons. What are the big sort of top line lessons? And how do you understand the impact of the uprisings in a longer arc of struggle for the liberation of Black people in this country?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, thanks for the question. I, appreciate the way the kind of anniversary has been used as an opportunity for the movement to reflect, which oftentimes we don't do enough of. I do think that since the uprisings of 2020, we have seen a shift in what's on the table politically when it comes to policing. Even if it's way not enough, or not as much as we maybe felt like was possible when we felt as powerful as we felt flooding the streets with millions and millions of people. And I think it's measuring that inevitable disappointment and also the wins is how we measure our power, how much of it we need, how effectively we're organizing and wielding it. So that kind of dissonance, there's just a lot of information there. And I think that that's important. In Chicago, we've seen investments in police alternatives. And yeah, that's because Chicago has elected people that are willing to consider different things. But those people ran on and were able to run on the platforms that they did because of the way that we kind of busted open, even how in the movement for Black Lives, we were talking and thinking about en masse policing, which is, away from even just looking at individual instances of violence or the acts of individual police officers or small scale reforms or training or new equipment. But let's actually look at where are resources going in our society, and why is so much of it going to policing when so much of it is not going to all these other places that we need it. And so maybe defund is a polarizing word, but if we're looking at, what are the proposals that people are actually considering in different places when it comes to how do we address not only policing, but structural violence, structural racism, and inequity in this country, we are looking at resources and where those resources are going, which I think leads us to better and more structural, big scale solutions than where we were at before. So that's where I see some of the impact. In Chicago, we've got a pilot of a non-police mental health crisis response system. You can call 911 in a mental health crisis response. And if you're in a certain part of the city, you'll get a care team, not a police officer responding to that crisis. And that's connected to, growth in our system of public mental health centers. So we've seen 2.5 of those, reopened. And that, that may be like small scale just for our city, but that's like the measure of how much power we were able to wield since the moment and the movement. And, it points to the power that's left to build.
Yeah, for sure. We have another like police alternative for like mental health crisis thing going on in Oakland also, that like I feel like the city council is constantly talking about increasing hours because like people use it, right? Like it's actually something that people want. And it's pretty meaningful. I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about the way that it feels like defund became was sort of like poisoned by like the right-wing media system is also that like there is such like a deep and like the idea of policing and the way that policing works in this country is so like its tendrils and its roots go really deep into our politics, our political imagination, and our discourse. And I think that like the moment of 2020 and thinking about the eruption of awareness about abolitionist alternatives to police was so big, and the fact that we are still talking about defund and that we're still talking about in like divest invest when it comes to policing in the military industrial complex also seems like huge to me. That like certainly is something I would never have imagined or dreamed about in like 2018. So like not a coincidence.
Yeah, and I'll say a couple other things about defund here. So I sometimes, I think sometimes we, even on the left, are like vulnerable to like mainstream status quo interpretations of what's going on. And so a couple of things I'll say. In 2020, there was like a city administered, not the movement, city administered budget survey that went out to that 38,000, I think, Chicagoans filled out. 87% of those people said in that budget survey that they would move money away from the police department and into, other services when you ask the question like that. Then in 2023, right, we have lots of progressives running, not just for mayor, but for city council seats all across the board in the city of Chicago. And some of those folks, there are movement people. They've been in the protests with us. And defund was like, I don't know how much money the like neoliberal class spent on, I would love to like cumulatively add up like how many millions of dollars they spent printing mailers that had like anti-defund messages, and like literally the races where they spent the most money sending out. I as like a Black voter on the south side of Chicago was getting multiple pieces of mail and like fear mongering about crime, anti-Brandon Johnson every day. It was Brandon Johnson for mayor, one overwhelmingly among Black voters in particular. And then two of our other, leftists in the city council who faced serious opposition from the real estate industry and others. These were the folks they were sending this propaganda against, and they won. So the idea that it's like an unelectable position. And then the last thing, now the like defund or police budget organizing or public health and safety now is the language that we're using to talk about it. Organizing in Chicago has continued. I first got involved in work resisting around the police budget in 2014. We're in a totally different landscape around it than we are now. We're looking at right now, there's $200 million that goes into the police department budget for vacant officer positions. They haven't been able to increase the ranks of the police department in years. Like no matter how many Be a Cop billboards or like police training facilities they build, they can't. It's not something people want to do. But at the same time, our city won investment in a youth jobs peacekeeping program. They had a pilot with just like 100 youth peacekeepers for the summer. They had 800 people apply. They're turning away young people that want to do the work of public safety. And so when we talk to people about that, and we're running, you know, a big door knocking and organizing program this summer in Black communities, in communities impacted by policing. We just got started. We've already had hundreds of conversations. And when you talk about it in this way, like, why are there public safety dollars that are going to policing? It's essentially a slush fund because they get that money and use it on who knows what, when we're turning away young people that want to do the work of public safety, when we have something like CARE, this non-police mental health crisis response that's not citywide yet, people are with us.
Yeah.
So that's the world that we live in that we didn't necessarily live in before 2020. And those are some of the things that are going to be hard to win and expand, but we can and are on the table. And that's not where we were at before.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about that too, because we have a similar phenomenon happening in Oakland where like they keep saying like, oh, we're going to run 2 police academies this year instead of 1 because we're so understaffed, but they can't get enough officer candidates into these academies. Like, it's actually wild. I mean, the flip side of that, of course, is also that like OPD is spending a ton of money on police overtime. So it's like we're in this like weird interstitial space where like arguably our movements have not been able to like move forward enough. And I feel like, I mean, one of the things I worry about often is the risk of backsliding because of backlash to programs that have not been fully implemented yet.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah.
That like the like neoliberals and even conservative folks in our communities are going to be able to point to those things and be like, look, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Even though like
them like one staffer.
Right. Even though
like,
traditional policing hasn't been working for years.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I also am thinking about, I guess, what happened in 2020 being also the confluence of a lot of factors, including, as you say, like the work that BYP 100, Dream Defenders, other organizations had been building for many years leading up to that punctuated moment. And I think that like there's an important lesson to draw there as well about 2020, that like the manifestation didn't come from nowhere. Right. That it was, I think that there is a narrative, like a more like a non-movement focused narrative of 2020 that's like suddenly all these people cared about this thing. But can you talk a little bit to some of the hard work of organizing that really led up to that moment, and how you think movements and movement organizations were able to prepare for the eruption of these like mass protests?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think about, it's been interesting to be asked to reflect on like 5 years since 2020, because I really see 2020 as like an inflection point in like a 15-year, like a 10 or 15-year arc of organizing that, you know, that really started in like 2012, 2013, around the time of the murder on Trayvon Martin, which is, you know, when Black Youth Project 100, which I was a co-founder of at the young age of 19. And then the Dream Defenders that, you know, I've also supported and we work closely with over the years. And at that time, like starting an organization that was like for Black young adults felt like an intervention in and of itself. And, you know, even I remember talking about abolition at like the founding gathering of BYP 100, and it like wasn't something most people had heard of. And that's probably not like the vibe in a like Black activist organizer. You know, that's something that people are familiar with if they're in, you know, movement at this point. So, you know, we spent the like 7-8 years before that building Black organizations, running campaigns around policing. It was in 2014 under the leadership of Miriam Kaba in Chicago with a formation called We Charge Genocide that a group of myself and other young people, we went to the United Nations and took a report around policing of youth of color in Chicago, and did all of this stuff. That was a part of, you know, connected to the campaign that won reparations for police torture survivors in Chicago as well. But that's when we started talking. That's when I first learned that 40% of the Chicago Police Department's budget went to, or 40% of the city of Chicago's budget goes to the Chicago Police Department. We started popularizing it then. The movement for Black Lives started with this like invest divest framework. BYP 100 had our agenda to build Black futures that used this frame of stop the cops and fund Black futures. So we were seeding and starting to talk about how do we use this frame of like where money is going to think about more structural solutions around policing, because many of us were clear that the like big reforms that were being offered to us, like body cameras or more training, weren't actually doing the thing of shifting the balance of power, to take power away from policing, which is this institution that has so much power over our lives, and then get at like the structural inequities and the manifestations of structural racism, which are not just the violence of policing that happens in this like violent, visibilized way, but it's also that that's happening in communities where like public funding for everything that people actually need has been taken away. So, you know, there were many years of like refining a frame so that when the societal conditions and the protest moment were like ripe to hear it, that frame, and that took, you know, form in like the slogan, defund the police and invest in our communities, which was like always meant to be a two-part thing, that we had sort of refined that and could make an intervention in that way by that time. And then the other thing I'll say is like, so that's some of the organizing. You know, we've been many years of Black young adult led organizing that led up to that moment, and kind of seeded a frame that people took and ran with. But I think the reality of COVID also put a light for people on what is the role of the state, what is the role of government, and why, when what we actually need is like universal health care, is a public health response. And like we're seeing the government do like new things that feel new. We're seeing direct cash assistance. We're seeing like public health programs and like testing around common a common virus, you know, all throughout our communities. We're like, oh, the government can do this, and yet the like consistent thing that I'm seeing, you know, the state do is continue to murder Black people with impunity. Like maybe that's not quite right, and maybe something different is possible. And I think more people were impacted by the like bizarro feeling of being in that moment of early COVID that you know, made them open to stepping into a fight for racial justice, that was talking about not just policing, but like the priorities of where public resources are going in our society.
Yeah, I think that combination of things is so like interesting and informative that like that early, I don't know, whenever I think back to that summer and just like how unsure, like when protests were first starting and like how unsure everybody was, like how certain people were about like we need to be in the streets, and how unsure also everybody was about like can we be together safely. And like honestly, I think one of the most beautiful things to me about that moment was that like people were like, yeah, we are going to figure out how to be in the streets together safely too. Is this like this combination of it is possible to do things differently collectively on a variety of different scales too, right? That like we can take care of each other, the state can take care of us too. Those feel really big, especially in like this moment where I feel like the sort of triumph of neoliberalism is not just about, you know, this like massive expenditure on police and the military, but it is also a triumph culturally about like individualism basically, and like the idea that like we have to all take care of our own selves and our own families, and screw everybody else, sort of, that like that alternative vision that you describe breaking through in that moment just felt so truly hopeful in a different way.
Yeah, and that hope is important and it drives people, and I think like there's like an emotional feeling of feeling so hopeful, and then like, wait, but not everything changed. That like I think has made a lot of people maybe like dismiss what has. And like my hope is that we can like let the information of that feelings and like let the lessons still pierce through that, yeah, a lot more was and has been broken open. We took advantage of some of what was on the table. There are some things that are still newly on the table that have like yet to be taken advantage of. And it takes a lot of organized power to shift something. And it is so much more than just protest or mutual aid or whatever people were, or political education, whatever people were doing. Like, yeah, we need like media institutions that can like compete with these, you know, I don't know if can I curse on the pod? I don't know.
Yeah. No.
These like motherfuckers who, you know, try to use, have tried to like manipulate our like movement slogans to tell a sensationalist and fear-mongering story about what defund the police means or about safety. You know, we need propaganda and media institutions. We need political power. We need to be able to say, if you won't meet our demands, we will unseat you, and have the actual organized disciplined power and majorities behind us to be able to do that. And then like the relationships, the discipline, the coalition to be able to, you know, do the collaboration and dance to like land wins. And so, yeah, I think about the work that I'm doing now, and I look around some of the rooms with, you know, I'm running this like Chicago Black Voter Project. We're knocking on Black people's doors and talking about the political moment all throughout the summer. And I like look around a room of people that are like leading canvassing operations in Chicago. And it's like people that came in, or at least were stepped further in, out of many of these like big protests and movement moments. And I just know we only capture, like I only was able to like absorb so many of those people. And that's true for any other organizer that you know. And so, yeah, I think some of the lessons too are like how in those moments of protest do we like make sure that we're winning over the biggest percentage of the 26 million people that are in the streets to actually like be a part of something. Because people, when they're a part of like a movement moment like that, you're being changed. And it takes infrastructure, strategy, training, organizers to bring that into something where you can actually like move in a way where you're gonna be able to like wield power. And our ability to do that is only ever like a percentage of the people power that's like on the table to be organized. So yeah, I don't know. In 2020, we ran a massive defund campaign. We put like 3,000 people through like a massive political education and training program where you're learning how to talk to your neighbors about, you know, the police budget, and you're meeting with your city council person and all of that. But that's only a small fraction of all the people who were, you know, moved by the moment. And yeah, I hope that the left like only gets better and better at like taking advantage of what's possible in terms of the people we can win over in those moments and develop into leaders.
Yeah. I think the thing that really struck me about your piece in Hammer and Hope recently was this piece about leadership and how like it is not sufficient to have like a breakthrough narrative moment. It is also necessary for there to be meaningful leadership. And like I think the expectation that a sort of breakthrough moment is going to be the thing that produces the results that we want is both like, it is, I think, how do I want to say this? It's like both a necessary kind of like hope moment, right, that you're describing, that's like it opens the door, and also like there's a need to like harness that excitement, that energy, while also explaining to people how power works. Like it's an opportunity to suddenly like get in people's ears about our power analysis and like our sense of the landscape, because like I think in a moment where you have millions of people in the street like that, it does kind of feel like everyone's with us. And like all the like weird corporate stuff that was happening where it was like suddenly everybody's like making these investments or whatever made it seem like there was this consensus, which like in retrospect, it's like, well, of course there wasn't, right? Of course, like our opposition was, as we were in the streets, as we were doing these things, scheming against us. And like, I don't know. I think that there's a way in which I think in retrospect about how, it's like you don't want to sort of stand in the way of people's excitement. At the same time, I think one of the offerings that you really bring to the table as an organizer and as a commentator is about that aspect of like helping people understand what the balance of forces actually is, and what it takes to win these things, because it is a long-term fight, and there are a lot of forces arrayed against us.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. I'm wondering too, in this moment where Trump's back in the White House, we are also in kind of a mass movement moment that like I recently, somebody shared with me a graph that showed that there's something like 3 times the number of mobilizations happening right now than there were in 2017, which is quite striking, because I feel like 2017 was also a moment where it just felt like people were ready to throw down, right? Like people were showing up at airports to stop the Muslim ban. Like it was just like there was so much going on, but we are in a moment now where we're seeing 3 times the amount, and also in a way that seems to be surprisingly sustained, despite the fact that like there's not a ton of like centralized coordination. What do you think is the opportunity for our movements in this moment? And who do you see, if anyone, filling the leadership roles necessary to guide this moment towards building greater power?
Yeah. I think those are really interesting pieces of data that I've seen, similar things. I think I've also seen that there's just like a much greater geographic diversity, like protests in rural towns, or there like hasn't been protest activity in however long. And just across the spectrum, we're seeing that. It's not just big cities, which is great and important and needed. And yeah, I think that the opportunity that exists, I think there is like a big tent of people that think what's going on is wrong, that can be won over to something radically different. And I think there's an opportunity there that will be like culturally a challenge for the left to fully hold. And, it's a very segregated country built on racism. Like, it's tough to have a whole bunch of people who've been really effectively taught to hate each other in, a working class coalition. And it's by being taught to hate each other that we have been kept apart, and like, because it's strategic to make all the people that could be in the strategic coalition to like undercut the billionaire class hate each other.
Right.
Or even hate each other, or not get each other, or be so segregated that there is like a cultural divide or whatever. So that is like one thing that I'll say. Like, yeah, lots of Trump supporters are going to be materially, economically hurt by his policies. Whether that makes them defect from his agenda or not is a totally different question. People's like political leanings is about their interpretation of reality. It's not like we have some like political scientist inside of us with like a
only.
I mean, they're subjective too, but that was, but even not just talking about like maybe the most difficult examples, there's just lots of people who are going to be impacted. If we think about Medicaid, 1 in 3 Black people in this country rely on some form of Medicaid funding for healthcare. He's like, he's talking about cuts that mean like rural hospitals in rural areas getting shut down. He's talking about, you know, kids not being able to go to the doctor, the cuts to food assistance programs. Like we're talking about families not being able to eat. And those are people that the left should be organizing, and organizing into a alternative vision for, you know, what government can and should do. Now, the project of actually like being truthful and trustworthy people who can say that we are going to be able to build enough power and then be like effective enough at transforming how government works to deliver it is a massive challenge. But yeah, I think that we need to be thinking about building powerful big tent coalitions built on, you know, a radical economic agenda that talks about race, that talks about gender, and that talks about a multiplicity of needs, and really polarizing against the billionaire class, and keeping that at the center of all of our messaging. So, you know, I think that the focus on Trump is important. I think the focus on corporations is important. Yeah, you know, just making clear that this is about tax cuts for billionaires that are going to leave families hungry. And like, which side of that do you want to be on? And we actually do want most people to be on the right side of that. We don't like, I think it is a moment to say, hey, a left agenda is the thing that can win. Like a Zoran Mamdani, free buses, free childcare, publicly funded affordable housing and food systems for everybody. Like that's a bold enough agenda that can compete with whatever lies these other people are spewing. Because right now, a story like whatever the status quo of the Democratic Party wants to like sell, which is like some lukewarm version of like protecting American normalcy, like that's not cutting it. That can't compete with anything politically. We need something bold and different. And we need leadership from the left that's willing to take on the challenge of actually figuring out how can we deliver that and how can we deliver majorities behind that, and not just be kind of like gotcha people that would rather be small and pure than effective and powerful enough to deliver anything.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I'm also curious in digging in a little bit on this question of like the idea that we have a cultural challenge also as part of our organizing. Like, how would you characterize that cultural challenge? And I think that like you implied that a little bit about the like staying small and pure and this sort of like story of the righteous few that like, I mean, honestly, like a lot of us certainly have like felt that way and like have had to like separate ourselves from that and be like, no, like we're not, it's not that we're not right, but we're not special in the sense that like we are actually the majority. Like,
yeah. I mean, I think this just comes back to the question of power and how part of it is like, are we like, most of us have had so few experiences having any or being close enough to power to have a super good understanding of how it works. Or we've been taught kind of like magical realism versions of like the civil rights movement. Like Rosa Parks sat down on a bus one day and then like we had desegregation. Like, no, people were knocking on thousands of people's doors. They were engaged in mass organizing, both like civil disobedience protest, both like doing that work when it was extremely dangerous too. Life-threatening work, and being willing enough to say, like, we actually do need political power and we do need to be able to elect the people who represent us if we're going to get the, you know, boots of racists off our necks. So yeah, I think we've been taught some like magical stories about how change has happened in the past. We've been distant from being able to see how power actually works. So that's like on one hand, like too few experiences, you know, being able to actually understand how power works, to have a great culture of understanding how we might wield it or build enough to change things. And then two, I think there's a lot of people who come into movement and it's really not rooted in a belief that things can change. And that's true about movement, but like the data, the data also says, I've been specifically focused on Black adults' attitudes and Black voter attitudes. But I think some of these things are more universal too. Like 83% of Black adults in the US want our economic system to be overhauled. We're like more than 50% pro-socialism, but it's like tiny percentage of people that believe those changes are ever going to occur. And that to me is the role of organizing and movement, is that like we've got to be winning people over, not just to agree with us, but to believe that we can make a change and then be willing to be a part of the activities, the organization, the power building work that can get us closer. And I think too often, people agree with us. Yes.
Yeah.
Like, but if you're in movement or if you're an activist and it's just rooted in wanting things to be different, but not believing that they can be, or being willing to do things that might get us closer, and take the risk of working with somebody who's problematic, like I would rather take the risk of dealing with people who have a ways to go and like have fought my freaking hardest to change things in the world that we live in, than, to have just talked about it or just wanted it to be different. And so maybe I'm speaking a little excessively critically. I'm not trying to be hard on people, but I think that's like a useful frame of like, your politics is not what you say. It's not what you read. It's not who you associate yourself with. It's about what you do. And like, if what you're doing is politics is like dealing in power, right? So like what we do should be building power toward the like socialist, anti-racist, everybody, jobs guarantee, free childcare, free food, housing for all, a universal healthcare future that we want to live in. And that requires us to do things like bring people in who don't agree with us or who maybe are a little problematic and need to be won over to some stuff. It requires that we pick our battles sometimes around which things are we going to try to convince people of first and which things are we going to let go for now. And it also means being willing to try to take over the systems that exist and manage public resources, and being honest about what's going to be effective and not at getting us there. While not compromising what the kind of like end goal and vision is.
Yeah.
Even if it's far away.
It also strikes me that like this thing about like, how do we get there? And like, what is the road is a question of imagination. It's just like, not a question of like imagining the future that we want to build. It's a question of imagining that we have the power to build it. That like, that is actually where our imagination is often deficient. And there's work to be done there in terms of like telling a credible story of like what it might be like to govern, or what it is like to govern in the places where we are, right? That's like something that, I don't know, I think a lot about also as like a movement media maker, that like what is the thing that we're up against is like a lot of the folks who agree with us being pre-influenced to think that government doesn't do anything. Because like, what has it done for us lately? Right? Like, there's a real question there.
Totally.
And I think a lot about this too, with regards to the sort of like national narrative about Chicago, and like how aggressively stacked against the Johnson administration a lot of the national press has already been, like even before he took office, right? That like in a lot of ways it feels like those narratives are designed to repress an imagination about what we could do together and what it would mean to govern. So I'm especially with Zohran Mamdani's win on Tuesday's primary, I've been thinking a lot about, I went back on Wednesday to your piece from last month and in these times, talking to a lot of folks organizing in Chicago about how things have changed over the last 2 years in Chicago, and like what the balance of power looks like now, and what you all were able to do with that balance of power. Yeah, I just think we don't have a strong grasp about what it truly takes to govern. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like how you've seen that shift take place, and like what you have yet to do in Chicago to build that kind of governing power.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think there's some really important, useful things to say here that are relevant to everyone. I will, and I think just to start, I think putting the Chicago left political project or Chicago movement in a tiny bit more context, that's like, yes, we won a union-backed mayor that came out of the Chicago Teachers Union, and out of United Working Families, that includes a number of other forces, for mayor 2 years ago. But that happened in the context of a militant labor movement, that includes the Chicago Teachers Union, that includes SEIU Healthcare, which has a super interesting, organizing history of coming out of a union built by Illinois Acorn, and others, that includes the movement that I was a part of with BYP 100 that protested, police killings, and really in struggle and partnership drew that comparison between the closure of schools, the closure of mental health clinics, and yet this reality of over-policing in Black communities, and a convergence of other movements. So that's like the movement context. And like we came up against the limit of what in a city with massive movement activity, with militant labor unions willing to go on strike, with serious organize. It's also the birthplace of like Alinsky style. We got 1,000,001 community groups that do good organizing. And there is a point at which, and this really became clear under Rahm Emanuel, like we need to be able to show that we have power politically. And so, that led to a number of interventions. And, notably, in 2019, the city elected a handful of socialists to our 50-person city council. So they're still a small minority. But like my alderwoman, Jeanette Taylor, she was a Kenwood mom who got involved in her local community organization and then went on hunger strike to get one of the schools that Rahm Emanuel shut down in that neighborhood reopened, and then ultimately ran for office. Rosana Rodriguez Sanchez, who's a badass Puerto Rican socialist, who has really been a partner in leading the charge on us winning treatment, not trauma, winning that non-police mental health crisis response. So those two and a handful of others were elected in 2019. And then the wins in 2023 included electing the mayor, Brandon Johnson, but also 19 progressives to our city council, which is a lot. But in a 50-person city council, it's not a majority.
Still not a majority, yeah.
It's a little ways to 26 votes. And then we have an elected school board, and I've been a part of helping elect community leaders to that. And so, there is this like bigger context that I think is important. And yeah, there's a lot of, I'll just say directly, like a lot of Brandon Johnson critique, and a lot of reduction of that political project to just Brandon Johnson and just his actions. And I think that's a mistake in terms of the lessons that we draw for two reasons. One, because the political project, as I've described, is so much bigger than one person's leadership, and it's so much bigger than just winning executive office. And the power structures that exist, like this doesn't change the relations of power between like the finance sector and the powerful real estate industry and a public sector union. Like those forces still have the economic power that they have and are still in struggle. And now that is shifted in some way, but the same forces that were backing up Rahm Emanuel's political decisions to privatize massive elements of the public sector for their own profit and gain at the expense of Black communities are then the same forces that are spending tons and tons of money to make you think that everybody hates the Brandon Johnson agenda. Right. And so like when you think about it in that way, you can have a clearer picture of what's going on. And yeah, so those forces are at play. I wrote a little bit about the opposition that we've faced from like the real estate industry, from the finance sector, and others in these times piece for anyone that's interested. And then you have like the reality of the difficulty of inheriting government, or stepping into government with a gutted public sector in an unequal place. You're responsible for this massive police department. You don't have enough people working for the departments you might want to grow. And government is like bureaucratic and slow and ineffective in some ways that certainly need to be reformed. And those are things that there are just constraints on how much you can change. And yeah, that's a challenging situation to be in, to say, I want to promise these things and I want to deliver them. And the actual work of getting your hands dirty to say, all right, this is what is, and we're going to take it from here to go from there, is harder than imagining how you would like it to be. Especially when you have attacks from all those local forces that I mentioned, especially when you have like Texas Governor Abbott saying that I'm going to like use the lives of newly arrived migrants as political pawns to bus them to blue cities to make the life harder of a progressive executive. And then there's only fucked up decisions that you can make in the context when you have tens of thousands of people arriving in your city who need immediate access to healthcare, who might have just the clothes on their body, who've gone through who knows what trauma. There's absolutely no adequate way to receive that challenge, and that is just one of many.
Yeah.
And
that's
so
real.
Yeah, and that's not to say, like, the takeaway I want people to have from that is not to say like, oh, then we shouldn't like put our money in behind politicians. It's like, no, it's to say we need so much more power and we need so many more leftists taking over government and taking responsibility for how public resources that belong to all of us get used to operate our society. And right now, if you think all politicians are fucked up, that means like that's because our power is so little of it. Like that means the people that you agree with don't have the power to shape how society is. And so I have appreciated, and like, I've never worked in government. So the question of actually how do you govern is like one that, yeah, I've seen in a closer way than many people, from being a part of political projects that have elected community members, elected organizers, elected leftists to office. But how you actually get in there and done it, I haven't done that either. But I do know that it's hard and complex, and seeing it has exposed a whole new set of contradictions and realities about how power works. And part of the reason why I think it's so important for movements to be engaged in elections, to be engaged in politics, and why it has been important for me too, is because it's not to say like, oh, just there's a limit of what we can do here and therefore we turn away. It's a mirror to say, no, this is an accurate reflection of how little power we have. And it's a window into how might we better understand how we need to build power, how we need to wield it, and how it works, so that we can actually take steps to deliver and come closer to the world we want to see. And as like hard and imperfect as it has been, there have been massive things I have seen that don't change the overall society in as big of ways as I would like, but do really radically matter and change people's lives. We've got thousands more youth jobs. There's like mental health clinics that were open before that weren't. We won like big investment in affordable childcare in the city. We abolished the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. And those are things, you know, and that's just at the city level, you know, a similar like inside-outside coalition that included electing organizers to office that meant that we ended money bail in the state of Illinois. And so it's not surprising that we face the backlash that we have. And I think it's important for movement folks on the left to be clear that what we have faced is enormous backlash, is the real estate industry, billionaires who are Zionists, and the finance sector and more in the third largest city in the country banding together and using all the tricks that they've got. And they've had more experience in politics than we have to undercut our ability to tax the rich, undercut our ability to deliver affordable housing, to divide our communities against each other. And, you know, there's a lot of lessons about how we're vulnerable to those attacks, about how we might combat them. And, you know, I don't know, send some love to Chicago. We're like inside of the hard contradictions of how we change things. And, you know, I think it's important that we share and learn from those lessons.
Well, I'm also struck too by like the story that you're telling and the analysis that you have is also about what happens when we are willing to struggle together. That like, it's not a thing that is like, you know, we solve this through running a candidate, having that candidate win, but also that like our movements need to be willing to both push those candidates once they're in office towards the policies that we want them to pass, because we know that like, we know that our opposition is doing that, right? By like giving them money and like giving them presents and like sidling up to them, making them feel real cool. But also like being willing to hang with each other and be like, how do we make sure that like this decision that this person like that it's possible for this person to make this political decision? Like that feels like a big aspect of it. And like talking about the city council, not just Brandon Johnson, like opening that vista on city politics. One, I'm like, it strikes me that like at the top of the show is talking about unitary executive theory and how like the far right has been pushing that since the 70s, right? That like that is like the way they want us to think about politics. But that there's so much more at work that makes it possible for somebody with a vision, for a movement with a vision to be doing that work. Yeah. And it like, I'm curious if there are like stories of that from especially the past couple of years in Chicago that you want to lift up about like movement accompanying electeds to like pass those policies.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, you know, I think you mentioned the city council, right? Like, yeah, we don't just elect people and then they magically like wave a wand and like deliver their whole agenda. And we still have to organize. We have to organize in the same conditions that they have to like govern in. And so, you know, if we talk about 19 progressives in a 50-person city council, if we want to pass a, you know, progressive policy, we have to be able to then pressure enough people to help the mayor get to 26 votes on any given issue. And we have to create the conditions in which our demands and policies are like popular in a majoritarian way. And, you know, sometimes that means like organizing public pressure, protests, lobbying elected officials at varying levels of government. Sometimes it also means convincing and working with like bureaucrats and city staffers who will have to implement certain policies. Like those are all of the things that go into creating the conditions to make something possible. And those are the types of activities on something like, you know, going after the like police vacancies that I talked about. Like, that's not necessarily message wise an easy thing to do. Like if Brandon Johnson says yes to that, he will take some hits for it. And so like, what are we doing to make it so he can do that and then still have the like political capital that he needs to do the next thing? And how are we convincing enough people in city council so when he introduces it, if that's how it goes, that it will pass, you know? And yeah, that's just like one example. And that we're doing the door knocking and the canvassing and the delivering voters to say like, yeah, if you do these things, it's going to be the things that, you know, people actually want.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that
sorry.
Yeah, go for it. No, go for it.
And then on the flip side, like we don't just have to be, we can't just be focused on, I think the other thing I like about politics and elections is like, a lot of us are trained to organize like you cut an issue and then you narrowly focus on this one solution to this massive societal problem. And I think the thing about working for candidates is like you get to talk about the bigger vision that has a multiplicity of things that we want to deliver. And everything is all in conversation with one another when, you know, you're in that context of politics. So I like and find that important. And I think it's important that as leftists, I think in Chicago, we went in and it was like, these are the community organizing campaigns that people have been working on forever. And they were designed in contexts when we were trying to find places to get concessions from people that were structurally moving the city in a different direction than we wanted. And that is what community organizing is kind of built for us to do. It's totally. Like, how do you narrowly, when you are not the people who are driving the direction of things, get some concessions from decision makers? You have no power over who they are, who they aren't. And so like, if we want to graduate from that a little bit, but like, if you stay in that lane, you only ever shrink what's on the table. If you only ever stay, you know? And so if we want to like think a little bigger, I do think we have to think about playing on a like diversity of issues. We have to think about making moves when things come up, when new opportunities arise to win and deliver things, be flexible enough to take advantage of them, even if they weren't the thing that we like democratically won our whole membership. And you know, I believe in member democracy and organizations and all that stuff, but we have to be nimble and willing to move on a variety of issues. And so like, you know, one example is in Chicago, there's been this whole debate around a youth curfew because there are these like, I don't know, lots of young people, they get together, they go downtown, whatever. And, you know, the alder people in the like rich downtown wards that have a lot of tourist activity don't like when a bunch of Black teenagers from the South and West sides are like hanging out in Millennium Park. And now there have been instances of violence at, you know, some of these as there are in neighborhoods across the city all the time. And so my point is not to dismiss the reality and problem of community violence. It's something that, you know, I have been impacted by. It concerns me too. And implementing a curfew on young people, which is like literally just a political way to empower police to do something they already actually have the power to do.
Right.
And it would be like a snap curfew, so they could implement it at any time with 30 minutes notice. And then like send police out. It's like, what kind of messages does that tell young people about like what they're worth, what they deserve, how they should be dealt with? Like, if the problem is violence, like, why are young people not okay that they're fighting or bringing a gun to a hangout? Like, why, you know? And how do we actually get at the root of that? Sorry, I'm going off on the curfew because it makes me so mad.
It's incredible. Well, and also like giving people 30 minutes notice is like, this is a joke, y'all. Like nobody can comply with it. It's a joke.
Trap. It's trapping young people so that you can police them. And like, in what way is that going to make someone supporting the development of young people? Like, I don't know. But so this is a debate in city council. It passed. The mayor vetoed it, which is like the first time a Chicago mayor has used their veto power in 20 years. And And, you know, then who but the billionaire-funded charter school industry PAC that spent tons of money against him in the mayoral race, that spent tons of money against the like pro-public education community members that ran for our school board. They're sending out text messages to voters in every single ward where a progressive voted against the youth curfew, like, Brandon Johnson and his progressive friends in city council are making you less safe. Like, that's the type of thing that's creating the conditions for how people are feeling politically in Chicago. And I'm like, they shouldn't be the only ones interpreting for people what every single thing means. Like, our opposition aren't narrowly thinking about any, and you know, those forces, it's the charter school industry. They don't, you know, or it's the real estate. They might not even care about the specific issue at hand, but they're taking advantage of a political opportunity to win people over to their side. And they're doing that for nefarious reasons. But there is something to learn from how do we think about taking responsibility for interpreting what's in the news for people, and in terms of like what it means for our lived reality and what it means for who is fighting for us and not.
Yeah. No, that seems quite right. And like the opportunity to make a world that it increasingly makes very little sense, make sense to people is like actually like huge, I think. And that is also the opportunity of having our folks elected, because they have a greater platform to make sense of those things to people.
Totally.
Well, this has been great, and it is always a delight to hear from you. And I don't know, I seriously do send some love to Chicago, because like y'all are fighting the good fight out there. Yeah, and I'm also excited to be in Chicago next weekend for socialism. So
awesome.
Yeah. Anything else you want to leave our listeners with? Anything we didn't get to?
I think that what the Trump administration and the billionaire right are doing in this moment are enormous. It's horrible, and it's like an enormous, in my opinion, ideological and organizing opportunity to win people over to a left socialist agenda. Like they're visibilizing what does government do, what does public resourcing do, and creating space, frankly, for a conversation of how can those things be different and better. And I just think we should step into this moment in a way that is thinking about it as a generational opportunity. I mean, opportunity like feels fucked up because it's fucked up. But really take responsibility for winning people over to like a left economic agenda that includes an analysis of race and all these other things, and not let that get lost in how mad we are at the personalities. And that's what I'm want to be a part of, and I'm focused on, and think that we all should be.
Yeah, no, that's what I want to be a part of too. Let's go.
Yeah.
My thanks again to Asha Ransby-Sporn for joining me today. You can find other ways to connect with Asha's work in the show notes. We'll link to the articles that we discussed as well, so you can read them. They are great. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Caden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstro. Kimmy David designed our cover art, and Logan Gross is our intern. If you have something to say, please do drop me a line. You can send me an email that we'll consider running on an upcoming mailbag episode at mailbag@convergencemag.com. I hope this helps.